At a certain point, many people who spend time online begin to experience something peculiar and unsettling. They scroll through their own timeline, past photographs and thoughts they once shared with confidence, and feel a growing sense of wrongness. Not mild embarrassment of an old haircut or outdated opinion, but something deeper, more visceral. It's as if they're looking at evidence of a crime they don't remember committing. Things that once felt like natural expressions suddenly seem like elaborate performances by a stranger. And naturally, when this happens, they become anxious, sometimes panicked. They think, I need to delete this. I need to erase these traces. Some do it methodically, scrolling back through years, removing posts one by one with desperate urgency. Others do it catastrophically, deleting entire accounts in a single afternoon. But the relief is temporary. A few months later, having rebuilt some minimal presence, they feel it again. That same wrongness, that same urge to erase. But what if I told you that this isn't a symptom of social media addiction or privacy paranoia, but rather one of the most profound existential problems of our time, one that a Danish philosopher anticipated more than a century and a half ago? You see, most online anxiety gets explained in terms of comparison, FOMO, or information overload. These are real phenomena, certainly, but they don't explain this specific horror, the horror of encountering your own archived self, the revulsion at your own digital permanence. The usual interpretation is that you're embarrassed by who you were, that you've grown and now feel ashamed. Or perhaps you're worried about how others will judge you based on these fragments. Some frame it as healthy desire for privacy in an overexposed age. But these explanations don't quite capture the visceral quality of the experience. They don't explain why seeing a photograph of yourself from 2 years ago, smiling at a party, can fill you with something close to existential dread. This is what Søren Kierkegaard was pointing to when he wrote about despair in The Sickness Unto Death. He described a particular form of despair as the desperate desire not to be oneself. Not a wish to be someone else, mind you, but an anguished attempt to escape from the self that one has become. Kierkegaard understood that the self is not a thing but a process, a relation that relates to itself. We are constantly in the act of becoming. But here's the terrible problem that Kierkegaard identified, and that the internet has amplified to an almost unbearable degree. When the self becomes fixed, objectified, turned into something permanent and unchanging, it becomes a source of profound suffering. You desperately want to abandon it, but you cannot, because it is you. It's like this. Imagine you're walking through the world. Now imagine that every few steps, a perfect wax sculpture of you in that exact moment is created and placed permanently in a museum. The sculpture captures not just how you looked, but somehow the precise quality of your thoughts, your beliefs, your concerns at that moment. These sculptures are on display for anyone to see, including you. At first, this might seem interesting, a record of your evolution, but soon you realize something horrifying. These sculptures don't change, but you do. You walk past the museum every day, and there they are. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of frozen versions of yourself, each one true at the moment of its creation, each one now a lie. The person who made that expression, who held that belief, they don't exist anymore. But the sculptures remain, insisting on their reality, their claim to represent you. This is what's happening when you scroll through old posts. Each one is a petrification of a self that was in motion, a self that should have been allowed to dissolve into the next moment. But online, nothing dissolves. Everything accumulates. Your timeline isn't a timeline at all. It's a museum of selves that should have been allowed to die. And this period, this realization that your digital past has become a kind of mausoleum you're forced to inhabit, can last quite a while. You're caught between two impossibilities. You can't simply delete everything and disappear entirely. Modern life requires some digital presence, but you can't bear the weight of this accumulated self, this archive that grows heavier each day. You're like a creature that has outgrown its shell but hasn't yet grown a new one, soft and vulnerable and desperately uncomfortable. Think of a lobster. As it grows, its hard shell doesn't grow with it. Eventually, the shell becomes too tight, too constraining. So the lobster must do something impossibly dangerous. It must shed its entire protective covering. It must make itself completely vulnerable while it waits for a new, larger shell to form. During this period, which can last days or weeks, the lobster is in terrible danger. It can't defend itself. Many lobsters die during this vulnerable time, but there is no other way to grow. The old shell cannot be expanded. It can only be abandoned. This is what's happening when you feel that desperate urge to delete your digital presence. You've outgrown the shell of your accumulated online self. Every post, every photo, every carefully crafted expression, it's all become a constraint, a rigid structure that no longer fits the living, changing being you actually are. You instinctively know you need to shed it, but the shedding process is terrifying because it means becoming invisible, undefined, vulnerable, in a world that constantly demands you present a stable, consistent identity. The usual response is to try desperately to curate a better, more authentic version. People think, I'll just be more careful about what I post. I'll only share things that truly represent my core values. But this doesn't work, because the problem isn't the content, it's the fixity. No matter how carefully you curate, the moment you post something, it becomes a frozen representation of a self that is already changing. You can't capture a moving stream in a photograph. You can only kill it, preserve its corpse. I must warn you about something. This realization about digital presence doesn't come with a clean, satisfying solution. I can't give you 5 steps to achieve healthy online boundaries, because that would miss the point entirely. What you're experiencing is a genuine confrontation with finitude, with the limitations of self-representation, with the impossibility of being a fixed thing while remaining alive. Let me tell you about someone I know who went through this. She was a writer, prolific on social media, sharing thoughts several times a day for nearly a decade. Her online presence had become so extensive that she'd accumulated thousands of posts, all searchable, all permanent. And then, about 3 years ago, she began to feel it, that creeping horror of seeing herself reflected back in all those frozen moments. Not embarrassment exactly, but something more like being haunted by hundreds of ghosts, each one insisting, "I am you." She tried the usual things first. She deleted the most embarrassing posts, the ones that seemed most out of alignment with who she thought she was now. But every deletion felt like a small death, and worse, it didn't solve the problem. She considered deleting everything, disappearing entirely. But then one evening, sitting in her garden watching her daughter play, she had a thought that changed everything. She realized that she didn't actually want to preserve any version of herself. What she wanted was to be allowed to disappear completely, moment by moment, the way a person does in physical life. When you have a conversation with a friend, their memory is soft, interpretive, changing. You're allowed to be forgotten, to be slightly different in each person's recollection, but online you're preserved exactly, searchable, quotable, screenshotable. She realized that the problem wasn't the quality or authenticity of what she'd shared. The problem was the sharing itself in a medium that turns process into product, that transforms the living flow of a person into a database of fixed statements. She wasn't outgrowing her old posts because they were immature or wrong. She was outgrowing them because she was alive, and life is the process of outgrowing everything you've been. So she did delete her accounts, but not with desperate urgency. She did it calmly, recognizing it not as failure, but as refusal to participate in her own mummification. She still writes, still thinks, still shares thoughts with friends in conversation, but she's learned to let those thoughts disappear, to allow them to serve their moment and then dissolve. Like breath, like waves, like every living process that sustains itself by not trying to be eternal. For a long time, she felt almost invisible, undefined. Without that constant feedback loop of posts and responses, she had to figure out who she was without an audience witnessing and validating her existence. It was disorienting, sometimes lonely. But here's what she discovered, slowly, over months. There was a self underneath all those performances. Not a fixed, essential self, but something more like a process, a happening, a way of being that could only emerge when it wasn't being constantly objectified and preserved. It's not excitement she felt. It was more like the feeling of remembering how to breathe after you've been holding your breath so long you'd forgotten you were holding it. The absence of that constant low-level anxiety about how you're being perceived, about what your accumulated posts say about you. just the quiet of being without needing to prove being. So what do you do in the meantime when you're caught in that uncomfortable space? First, understand something crucial. There is no right answer, no correct way to be online. This isn't a problem to be solved, but a tension to be lived with. Every choice you make will be imperfect, will create its own discomforts. But you can start paying attention to the feeling itself. When you feel that urge to delete, don't immediately act on it or suppress it. Just notice it. What exactly does it feel like? Where do you feel it in your body? Is it panic, shame, revulsion? And more importantly, what is it you're trying to escape from? The judgment of others? The judgment of your present self toward your past self? Or something deeper, the horror of being fixed, of having created a self that won't let you change? You can do small, simple things without expecting them to solve anything. Maybe you post something and resist the urge to check how it's received. Not as discipline or rule, but as experiment. What happens when you drop a stone in the water and walk away instead of watching the ripples? Maybe you let old posts remain without going back to reread them. They don't need to represent you. They're just marks that were made, like footprints in sand that the tide will eventually erase. And you observe the process of petrification as it happens in real time. You notice how, even as you're writing something, part of you is already trying to position it, to imagine how it will be read. You watch this happening without condemning it or trying to stop it. Because the watching itself begins to create a little space, a little gap between the living self and the performed self. And most importantly, you stop, or at least begin to notice when you're doing it, comparing your present self to your past selves, or to the selves you imagine you should have become. Stop checking if you've grown enough, changed enough to justify deleting your old posts. Stop trying to curate a trajectory that will make sense to observers, including yourself as observer. Because every time you do this, you're participating in the same petrification, just with different anxiety. Paradoxically, it's only when you stop trying to manage your digital presence into some coherent, defensible whole that you begin to find a kind of freedom within it. Not the freedom of perfect curation or authentic representation, but the freedom that comes from recognizing that no representation is adequate, that every self-presentation is a failure if you expect it to capture the living process of being a person. And in that recognition, there's strange relief. You can post or not post, delete or preserve, and none of it ultimately succeeds in fixing you. You remain alive, which means you remain unknown, even to yourself. Perhaps the reason the urge to erase your digital self is so strong is not because you're running from something shameful, but because you've outgrown the very possibility of being a fixed self. Not because you're more mature or evolved, but because you've bumped up against the limitations of self-representation. Every post is an absence of the moment in which it was written. Every carefully constructed image is the absence of the living face that changes with each expression. You're surrounded by these absences claiming to be presences, these dead things claiming to be you. And in a way, you're being forced back to a very old question. What am I when I'm not being watched? What exists when there's no record, no witness, no validation? Not nothing. That's the fear, isn't it? That if we're not performing, we'll disappear entirely. But this is where Kierkegaard becomes so important again. He knew that the self is not a thing that can be captured, but a relating, a process, something that exists in the movement between what it has been and what it might become. It doesn't need to be preserved. It needs to be allowed to happen. So when you feel that desperate urge to delete everything, maybe you're not being neurotic or running from your past. Maybe you're responding to a genuine spiritual crisis. The crisis of having inadvertently created a version of yourself that you can never become, because it's already complete, already frozen, already dead. And you, being alive, cannot fit into that coffin. Walk through that doorway if you need to, delete it all if that's what it takes to breathe again. But do it knowing that you're not solving a problem. You're just refusing to be a monument to yourself. You're choosing the discomfort of being undefined over the security of being petrified. And yes, it will be uncomfortable. Yes, you'll feel invisible sometimes, uncertain. But you were never actually visible in those posts anyway. You were just preserved like those bodies in Pompeii, perfect outlines of where someone once was, but empty of the life that animated them. And maybe that's enough. to exist without insisting on your own permanence, to think without needing to preserve every thought, to change without having to justify the change to an archive of who you were. Not because you've achieved some enlightened state, but because you've remembered that being alive means being willing to disappear, again and again, moment by moment. You just forgot for a while that this was the only option. The internet made you think you could be both alive and permanent. But you can't. No one can, and now you know.